The Danair RN-16 palm nailer is fairly simple to disassemble. Let's get started. You'll need a crescent wrench, a 5/32 Allen, some type of tool. I use picks to remove O-rings, and a flathead screwdriver. The first step is to remove your nose and guide or nose guide assembly. There are two flats on the side of the nose. Go ahead and put your crescent on there, loosen it. Depending on the tool that you have, the nose and guide are either going to be two separate pieces or they're going to be an assembly. Go ahead and take your clean dry cloth and wipe that down, inspect it to see if it is still a good usable part, and set it aside. You have the 115 spring that will come out of this part of the tool, and depending on if you're using all three spacers or more or less, you're going to have some spacers come out of that tool. They act as lock washers, and they also control the depth that the nail is driven into the product. So wipe all three of those down, set them aside. Take your 5/32 hex wrench and undo all four cap screws. Once you get these all out, you're going to have three parts of the tool. You're going to have the housing assembly, the cap assembly, and the motor assembly. Screws aside and pull it apart. You have the housing assembly, cap assembly, and the motor assembly. Let's start disassembling the housing assembly. This has an O-ring in here. Let's go ahead and remove this O-ring. Set it aside. Then the 114 bumper seats in the housing of the tool. It has a little indentation to where you can get something in there to pry it out. You want to be gentle because it is a urethane part, so you don't want to damage it, and you also don't want to scratch your metal. It's kind of a donut-shaped urethane piece. It does have that one notch out. You want to check to see if it was swollen or if it was flush with the housing. If it is swollen, it will need to be replaced. If it is flush and seats well, it is still a usable part. Go ahead and wipe it off and check it for cracks or chunks missing or anything like that, but get all the debris off of it, inspect it, and decide if it's usable or not. Take your housing and your dry cloth and wipe down the whole inside to remove any oil, debris, anything that may be in there. And then take a look at your metal and make sure that it's not gouged, polished, etched, or worn on that inside diameter. And then set that aside. The cap assembly, the 112 gasket may be stuck to it, may be a little bit adhered, or it may just come off. This will be oily, or it could be dry and brittle. You need to check and see if it's still a usable part. It should be fairly wet with oil. It should be a little bit pliable, not brittle or torn anywhere or anything like that. Decide if that is a good part or if that will need to be replaced. Go ahead and take your pick or what you're going to use to carefully remove that O-ring from that O-ring groove. At this point, I use a flathead screwdriver to carefully go in there and pop your 119 valve seat out of the cap. It will be kind of snug. If it comes right out, it could be an older part that has shrunk and hardened over time and would need to be replaced. If it sticks or your urethane is all gummy and some of it stays here, then that will need to be replaced. Wipe your cap all the way down, get all the grease and any debris that may be in there off of it, and check it for any wear, polished areas, or etchings. Set it aside. The 119 valve seat is a metal washer with urethane bonded to it. You want to wipe this down so that you can inspect it. You want to make sure that that urethane is still pliable but not soft and gummy, and you want to make sure that it is still adhered to that metal insert. So you kind of want to put pressure along the outside on the back. If it is loose anywhere from that insert, it will need to be replaced. And then if you take a pick and it sinks in there, it should kind of indented a little bit, but it should not sink in. If it sinks in, then your urethane is soft and gummy, and this part will need to be replaced. The last part is the motor assembly. This has the 105 valve, the 104 cylinder, and the 108 piston and driver. I take all three of those apart and I start with the 104 cylinder. I'm going to wipe it down with the O-ring and the bumper still on there so I can handle it a little bit better. You're checking this part for metal, rusted areas, or any metal that has been displaced or gouged. And you're going to carefully remove this O-ring. The 187 bumper is a rigid urethane piece. It's flat on one side and rounded on the other to seat in that groove around the bottom of the 104 cylinder. It can be kind of difficult to remove if it is still rigid as it should be, so I carefully get some leverage to where I can lift it out of there. If it gets stuck in the O-ring groove, just carefully pry it apart, and then you're going to want to wipe it down so you can take a look at it. You want to inspect it for any cracks on either surface and make sure that this is still rounded and that it's not soft and gummy or you can't break it apart, to decide if that's still a usable part or not. Now you have all the metal of the 104 to inspect, so just wipe it down a little bit more careful and inspect it. If there's any rust or anything like that, you can hit it lightly with a Scotch-Brite to remove that rust so that it doesn't cause the tool to bind up, but you want to be very careful with the metal. The next part is the 105 valve. We're going to carefully remove that O-ring. This is an aluminum part, so you don't want to drop it or anything like that to cause it to get out of shape. You want to wipe it down on the inside and the outside, and you're going to check for excess wear in here. It could be polished and worn a little bit from riding up on that O-ring, up and down on the O-ring, so check that part and see if it needs to be replaced. That leaves the 108 piston and driver assembly. You want to carefully remove these two O-rings. Wipe down this part. These parts are Loctited and pressurized together, so they should not come loose at all. If there is any play between the two parts, this will need to be replaced. If the O-ring grooves are damaged at all, you will need to replace it because of that issue. So you just kind of want to wipe it down and check for any damage to either of the metal parts, and you want to make sure that that is still adhered sufficiently. Now that you have your Danair RN-16 palm nailer disassembled, take a look at your parts and decide which ones need to be replaced. All parts can be ordered individually, or we have two kits available. We have our ASOK1 O-ring kit for the palm nailer. It has all 6 O-rings the tool requires, the 187 bumper, the 112 gasket, and a small tube of lubricant. We also have our rebuild kit, which has all of the internal rubber and urethane parts that the tool requires. This is part number AS-RNRK, and it has this O-ring kit that I described earlier. It has the 119 valve seat and the 114 bumper.